Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. For the last couple years, we've been working pretty closely with an Enneagram master by the name of Dr. Beatrice Chestnut. You might know her from books she's written like The Complete Enneagram and her most recent book, which is 9 Types of Leadership. And we've been doing these projects together. Really, I think what we ultimately want to end up creating is some sort of, I know you hate this word, Joel, but synergy between these two systems. But in the meantime, we've been, trying to really focus on making the program that Beatrice worked with us called the Enneagram Roadmap even better. And so we have had her in the studio, and we wanted to take this opportunity to record some really good content for the podcast around the Enneagram while we have Beatrice in the studio. So first of all, welcome back to the podcast, Beatrice.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Always good to talk to both of you.
And the thing that we've been discussing lots of different angles of Myers-Briggs and Enneagram, but one of the things that we've noticed as people who produce a lot of content around both these systems is that when you look at the worlds, the Myers-Briggs world and the Enneagram world, there are a lot of people who are trying to learn and pattern recognize some things around both these systems. And in that, attempt to learn and observe and try to figure things out, some of the patterns aren't, they kind of circle the drain, but they don't quite get it in the bullseye. So what we wanted to do was talk a little bit about some myths and some misconceptions that people have around the Enneagram. And so, because that's your area of expertise, not ours, we thought you would be one of the best people to talk about that. So in this particular podcast, we're going to do a little short series. We're going to talk about the 3 different centers, the body center, the heart center, and the head center, and some of the misconceptions within those 3 types in each of the centers. So we're going to start with the body center today. And I, as a person who's learning more and more about Enneagram, in large part by proximity to you, actually, you've really helped me figure a ton of stuff out, particularly in your work with subtypes and lots of different angles and really understanding some of the nuance. But when you look at this ocean of people who are talking about Enneagram, what are some of the things that you see surfacing that lead to some of these myths and misconceptions?
I think sometimes people have recognized the types in terms of some of the high-level traits or characteristics. And so they get certain ideas about how those types are, and they don't always recognize how they may be taking their perception of those traits a little too far and not seeing some of the nuances or complexity in the types. And of course, one of the great things about the Enneagram system is that it maps the complexity of the human personality. And the good thing about that is it tells us a lot about ourselves if we're interested in learning about our own type. However, there is a bit of a learning curve. And sometimes when people learn a little bit, they may think they have the whole picture when really it takes a while to kind of get the real depth and richness of each of the types.
Yeah, we see this in the Myers-Briggs world. In the early days when you're learning a system like that, you learn, oh man, introvert, extrovert, and well, you're an extrovert, so you're going to do this. And it's there's a lot of truth to something somebody might say in a general sense of somebody being an extrovert, but there's a lot of different types of extroverts, right, in the Myers-Briggs system. And so what kind of extrovert are you and how are you showing up that way? You can't generalize across all the extroverted types. And so as then people learn the system, they understand the nuance there. And some of the myths or misconceptions, they have more fidelity around how that stuff works when they understand things like cognitive functions, that we teach on the CAR model and stuff. And so I'm guessing it's a good thing when someone's learning a system, they're trying to implement it, teach it, talk about it, write about it, and yet they're missing maybe some of the fidelity. And that's one of the things we want to talk about today is and we want to zoom in on maybe definitely the body, triad with the 8, 9, and 1 types today. And then we'll continue on this series and then really get a sense of what can we be looking for as we understand the system more to get a really good sense of these types, not just the, I'll call it the Twitter post sense of a type.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, exactly. And I think it's very similar to what you're talking about in terms of the Myers-Briggs with the Enneagram. And I think another way that sometimes people have a little bit of a high level and not so nuanced view of the types, but they may not realize they have not enough nuance, is not knowing the subtypes. And I know one of the things we've talked about a lot is how important the instincts and the subtypes are to understanding the Enneagram more fully. And so I think as we talk about some of the myths and misconceptions about the types, I can refer a little bit to the subtypes in terms of how that adds more nuance in the similar way that you're saying about different kinds of extroversion, for instance.
That's what I love about your book, The Complete Enneagram. If you haven't got a copy of that, you got to go get a copy because it's a great book. And it really breaks down the system and talks about these 27 subtypes that you've really illustrated in the book. And the other piece too is we have some podcasts on this. We highlight and touch about it. And even in the Enneagram Roadmap, you talk about the subtypes. It's such an important aspect, I think, of the system that you bring forward that I truly resonate with.
Before we move into the first type in the body triad, when we hit some of these myths, would you be willing to remind the audience member, or if they're not familiar with what subtypes are or instincts, could you do like a really quick little overview? We have recorded podcasts on it before, and you as a listener, if you haven't heard them, I highly recommend checking it out. But just like a quick little, just like a 5-minute.
Sure. So as many people may know, the Enneagram is built on the idea that we have 3 centers of intelligence: body, heart, and head. And there are 3 types in each center that kind of live more from that center than the other 2 and are based in that center in a particular way. And then the subtypes is really another breakdown into 3. So there are 9 types. And for each of the 9 types, there are 3 what we call subtypes, which is based on which of one of 3 basic instincts or instinctual drives is dominant in that person's experience. And those 3 instincts are for self-preservation, a social instinct, which is kind of about how you're related to the group, again, as a survival strategy, and one-to-one bonding, which is called sexual instinct. So we all have all of those 3 instincts. However, each person tends to have one they overdo, that's more dominant, and we call that the subtype. So if you're a 4 and your self-preservation instinct is most dominant in your experience, then we call you a self-preservation 4. So with 27 types, 3 versions of each of the 9 types, that allows for a lot more nuance and specificity, what you call fidelity. And I love that word, in understanding the type. And I do think that's where a lot of the misconceptions about the Enneagram types come in. If you've only learned the 9 types and you don't know the version of the subtypes that I teach and write about, which comes from Claudio Naranjo, I think you're missing a whole level that adds so much to the understanding of what the types are like and the different varieties, the different ways they show up.
Yeah, and that's a lot of times where you get things like look-alike types. The distinction of a subtype, like certain types of like 6s might look like a 1 at times, or certain types of 4s might look like an 8 even, or something to that effect.
Exactly. And I think sometimes learning about the subtypes helps a lot with typing. And another really important feature of the subtypes is this approach actually includes types that aren't even described at all in the 9 types. So for instance, if you've just read a book about the 9 types, you may not even understand that there's a type called a self-preservation 4 that's kind of a 4 that doesn't look like a 4, or a social 7 that's a 7 that isn't the typical 7 at all and actually has some paradoxical or contradictory traits to what we normally understand as a 7.
Yeah, as a sexual 3, it took me a really long time to figure out that I was a 3, because most of the descriptions of 3s I now realize are social 3s. And I didn't really understand. I mean, I didn't resonate with that. In fact, there are some traits of social 3s that based on my type, I actually repress and I push away. And so when I read descriptions of social 3s, I didn't really resonate. And it wasn't until I read a description of a sexual 3 that I was like, okay, that's me.
Exactly. And that happens to not only sexual 3s, but self-preservation 3s, because really the main 3 that's written about in the books about the 9 types is the social 3. And so sometimes, 2/3 of 3s don't readily understand that they're 3s because they don't relate fully to the description of the 3s in most of the books that's really about the social 3, and the other 2 are really different in specific ways.
Yeah. So there's a lot of value in understanding the subtype, which is a combination of the Enneagram type with its dominant instinct. So having said all that, let's head to this concept of the myths and misconceptions that people will have. And in particular, this episode of the podcast, we're going to focus on the body types. So the body types are, can you just kind of describe a little bit about body types and then you launch into myths if you'd like to?
Sure. So the body-based types are types 8, 9, and 1. And I don't really use the names of the types in my book very much because I think sometimes they also contribute to misconceptions. But if people are new to the Enneagram, it might be interesting to know that the 8 is sometimes called the boss or the challenger. The 9 is sometimes called the mediator, the peacemaker, and the 1 is sometimes called the perfectionist or the reformer. And I'll start in with type 8. So type 8s are types that sometimes people see as being people who are always angry or who are really aggressive. And the core emotion connected to the body types is anger. And as with all 3 of the triads, there's one type that tends to overdo that emotion, one type that underdoes that emotion, and one type that's kind of in conflict with it. So 8s are the type that overdo anger, meaning they readily feel it more than most people of other types. And they often describe anger as energy. It can feel like feeling passionate or feeling really strongly about something and feeling an energy moving through their body. And while 8s do have easier access to anger and can express it more easily and with less inner conflict than a lot of other types, I think it's really a myth that people may have that 8s are always walking around angry or that they're always about to explode at any minute. I think oftentimes 8s really don't need to get angry because there's a certain strength and gravitas and power that they carry along with them that they don't necessarily need to express aggression. And certainly a lot of 8s don't get angry very much or, all the time at all. And I think it's really important to recognize more breadth of the 8 traits than just anger and not see them as people who are overly aggressive or aggressive most of the time.
So then the myth would be that they have like knee-jerk responses to things.
Or I think that they're walking around expressing anger like 80 to 90% of the time, which just isn't the case.
Like a guy ready to start a bar fight or something.
Right. Now, certainly if you have an 8 that's maybe less self-aware or less healthy or hasn't done very much inner work on themselves, certainly, yeah, there can be, 8s can have anger issues and they can get angry. They can get triggered and be angry, quite a bit. However, most 8s at sort of that have done any kind of work or that have examined themselves at all don't necessarily express anger on a regular basis.
So it wouldn't be something where a person would, if you're an 8, it's not like people are going to like describe you as like, yeah, that's an angry person.
Yeah, not necessarily. And I think sometimes what people don't see in 8s, which is sort of the other side, is their sensitivity. And 8s will often describe themselves as being able to have access to anger, but having a lot of sensitivity on the inside. Now, some 8s are more aware of that sensitivity than others, but there is that sensitive core. And I think sometimes the fact that people see 8s as bullies to too great a degree means that 8s end up actually getting bullied themselves. I have an 8 friend who has had the experience at many even Enneagram workshops where she feels like people kind of have license to say negative things about 8s and even express aggression toward 8s. And so I think it's really important to recognize that while 8s do have access to anger, and that can actually be a strength in that they can confront things more directly, they can engage in conflict more easily than some people of other types. At the same time, there is this inner sensitivity, and part of the growth path of the 8 is getting more in touch with that. And if we're seeing them as always angry, sometimes we don't allow them to bring forth their natural sensitivity, and that's not good for anyone.
So really the biggest challenge of that myth is that, because I think just in general, when people are angry all the time, we associate anger with strength. And so the challenge of that one is that we in our behavior towards an 8 that we see maybe as having a lot of strength because they have so much anger, that we don't provide enough space for them to, move away from that, go to vulnerability, because we just see them as impenetrable. Like, we can say anything to this person, and yeah, they might react with anger, but it's certainly not going to hurt their feelings or anything. Whereas allowing themselves to, get in touch with a part of themselves that can have hurt feelings is a part of their growth path. So it's how we treat them with this myth that's particularly damaging.
Exactly. And I think sometimes 8s need that space to recognize that one expression of strength is being vulnerable, which is important. And I think another piece of this is a lot of us who aren't 8s have negative associations with anger. So we think somehow anger is bad. And I think it's important to recognize that all emotions are valid and can be useful in some circumstances. It's more about how we express it, how we use our feelings. And so it's important to recognize that sometimes 8s being able to be angry is actually a strength and actually helps us get things out, be direct about things, have productive conflicts. And so it's important to, on the one hand, not see 8s as always aggressive, but also see the value that they bring. And like you're saying, give them space to get in touch with that sensitivity that's often underneath.
So as we move from the 8 to 9, type 9, what would be a myth or misconception that a lot of 9s face, or people face around 9s?
So 9's passion, sometimes called a vice or a chief feature, is sloth or laziness. And 9s can be out of touch with working on behalf of their own agenda or taking action on behalf of themselves. And so sometimes I think people see 9s as lazy, or that they don't do things, or that they're overly passive. And certainly 9s can be passive, but the laziness here refers not to a kind of person who doesn't do anything or just lays around all the time. The laziness is a very specific kind of laziness, which is a kind of going to sleep to one's own need to act for themselves in the world. And so the way we sometimes define sloth or laziness when we teach about 9s is not that they're not taking action, but they're taking all the possible actions except the right action, except the main thing they need to do for themselves, often for their own personal agenda. So say a 9 in the workplace can be very active and get a lot done, but sometimes they'll be doing things for others, or they'll be doing things that aren't quite the most important thing or the top priority that's really about them. So it's important to know that 9s actually have a lot of energy. But what happens is they can diffuse that energy out over a lot of over the environment or in helping other people, and not kind of gather in their energy and use it in a targeted way, in a focused way on their own behalf, or to further their own self-interest or their own priority.
So from the outside looking in, it looks like they're unmotivated maybe for the things they want in life, or things that would matter to them to advance their career. And here, their experience probably is they're extremely busy. And so people, they're lazy, but it's just not applied to the right places, is what you're saying.
Right. And again, people can get this sense because maybe 9s don't step forward, or they can look indecisive. But again, once a 9 starts to do their work, what happens is they get really good at focusing or calling in the energy that they disperse a little bit too much when they're thinking about creating harmony in the environment or supporting a lot of other people in their lives. And when they call that energy in and they get good at connecting more to what they really need to do, they can be very powerful and exert a lot of energy and take action in the world. And so it's important, I think, always too, to give people room to grow and not sort of really pigeonhole them as being a certain way. And so while Nines can be passive, they tend to work very hard. In fact, the social 9 is one of the biggest workaholics on the Enneagram, right after type 3.
You had mentioned that type 8 was anger overdone.
Right.
How do we look at type 9?
So 9s basically reflect a kind of anger underdone, or someone who goes to sleep to their anger. So most 9s, when you ask them when they're new to the Enneagram, if they ever get angry, they'll say they either never get angry or they only rarely get angry. And again, a misconception is that 9s don't have anger. And usually they do have anger, but because it feels threatening to be angry, because it disturbs the peace, and they're all about creating peace and harmony in their environments, they can go to sleep to their anger or not always be aware of it. But part of the growth path of 9, again, is being able to express it more directly. Sometimes what will happen with 9s before they work on themselves is they'll either explode every once in a while, or their anger will leak out in passive-aggressive forms as stubbornness, saying yes to doing something and then not doing it, passive resistance. But one of the key things 9s can do for themselves when they grow is to get more in touch with their anger and learn that it's okay to be angry.
And another path probably also would be this is like undermining energy, like this passive aggressiveness. It's being more direct. The things you oppose maybe, or the things you want for a 9 would also make sense.
Exactly. One reason 9s tend not to be in touch with anger is they have this underlying belief that anger causes separation. And they're very sensitive to separation, and they want to stay connected to people. And so once they learn that actually anger can bring you closer to people, and it also helps you create boundaries and get more in touch with your own power, oftentimes 9s can learn to be better at expressing anger and being more direct about what they need.
So just like we can, if we have an 8 in our life, we can get this impression that they're impenetrable and we can say anything to them, and that actually doesn't necessarily allow them space they're not going to be incentivized to get vulnerable if they think people are going to say bad things to them. So our behavior towards an 8 might unintentionally stall their growth and development. What would be the equivalent to a 9? Like, what are the kind of messages that people with these myths give to 9s that can also, sort of be counterintuitive for their growth?
I think there's a way that people can pigeonhole 9s as being sort of perpetually passive, not able to get in contact with what they want. Now, it can be hard for 9s to know what they want, but it doesn't mean that they don't know what they want deeper down. Usually, there's just something that's gotten in the way of that. And usually, it's a fear of coming into conflict with other people. So if we encourage 9s to say no and create boundaries and express anger and be more direct, and if we ask 9s questions about what's going on and how they feel and what they want, often that supports 9s in bringing forth what they really feel and opening up a space for them to get more in touch with their own priorities.
So like in the sense of like, oh, you're just milquetoast, that will divert the 9's attention to now the relationship and whether or not the person is disconnecting from them by giving them criticism. And so now their mental real estate is applied to the relationship with the person as opposed to getting applied to figuring out what it is they want and being able to focus on that. So it creates an environment that isn't necessarily conducive for them taking the right action, but encouraging them, be sort of a cheerleader and like, I think you've got, what you want, or you've got inner wisdom, or consult what means something to you, and I'll be there to help you out. Or would those be better messages for 9s?
Yeah, definitely. I think 9s often have the experience of being overlooked. And so it's important not to overlook the 9 or not to take for granted that they don't have an opinion. And sometimes what is really helpful for 9s say they need a little time. So if you're asking a 9, what's your opinion on this, or what do you want, and they're not sure, it's really good to make that okay, to normalize not necessarily knowing what you want right away. And you could say something like, okay, well, think about it and get back to me tomorrow or the next day. And I think that gives nines a lot of space to get in touch with the fact that it is possible for them to know what they want. They just may need to work on bringing that out a little bit more.
Okay, let's move over to 1 now. So we've got type 8, which you said was that kind of that underpinning of anger, the anger energy, a little overdone. I wasn't really clear on how you classified 9. Did you say it was underdone or just kind of neutralized?
Underdone, yeah.
And so then would 1 be more neutral energy around this, or?
I would say 9s are kind of in the middle between sort of overdoing it and underdoing it, and that the way I frame it is they're in conflict with a little bit more. So a lot of 1s will also say they don't necessarily feel like they're angry. However, what happens is 1s, because they want to be good or perfect and they see anger as a bad thing, they will often try to put a lid on it. And so 1s often do feel angry for various reasons. People aren't doing the right thing. The world isn't a just place. And instead of really getting in touch with it and expressing it, they can repress it or not allow themselves to express it. But of course, anytime any of us has a feeling that we aren't processing and expressing, it doesn't go away. So what happens with 1s is anger leaks out as irritation, annoyance, resentment, and often 1s may not relate to being angry, but they will relate to being irritated, annoyed. Even you can see it sometimes in self-righteousness. Now, I do need to say there is one subtype of 1 that feels more okay being angry and that gets angry on a more regular basis, and that's the sexual one. So the other 2 1s tend to really not express anger as much, and then it leaks out. But the sexual one is a person who is more likely to get angry.
And so what are the the big myth or the big misconception that 1 typically has?
I think one big myth that people have about 1s is that they're all perfectionists or that they're all perfectionistic in all areas of their life. Most 1s are oriented toward making things better, toward improvement. But especially when you learn the subtypes, you realize that there's really only one of the 3 type 1 subtypes that's the true perfectionist. When I started teaching about the subtypes, I would have 1s that weren't that subtype coming up to me and saying, thank you for saying that all 1s aren't perfectionists, because I don't relate to the word perfectionist. I'm not perfectionistic in all areas of my life. Even if I want, say, the world to be a better place, I'm not out there perfecting everything. Also, even perfectionistic 1s will often say, I'm very perfectionist in certain areas of my life, but then there's some areas of my life that I really don't apply a perfectionistic standard. So, for instance, my desk is really neat and my work is really orderly, but my car is a mess. Or my bedroom, I tend to not pick it up. So there is a way that 1s will focus their perfectionistic tendency on one area, but it's not monolithic. And I think sometimes people don't understand that perfectionism isn't true of all 1s or isn't true of everything that a particular 1 does.
Which is the subtype that is perfectionistic?
So the self-preservation one would be the true perfectionist. That person tends to want to perfect themselves and everything in their environment, everything they do. There's a big need for controlling every little thing. And so that would be the true perfectionist. What we say for the social one is that they're perfect and that they're more thinking about what the right thing to do is and not necessarily perfecting everything in their environment. And then the sexual one perfects other people. So their focus is a little bit more on the outside, on making other people more perfect or reforming society. So sexual ones are really reformers much more than perfectionists.
So then what is the path of growth for 1s then? That a message like, well, you're just being a perfectionist. How could that harm their growth if they keep getting that message?
So I think sometimes having compassion for people for like, say, the self-preservation one who is a perfectionist, and that there's a reason why they're maybe worried about everything. And sometimes self-preservation ones where people who had to take a lot of responsibility on themselves early on in life. Even when they were little kids in their family, they may have felt responsible for the whole family. So one thing is to have compassion, because when a one is perfectionistic, oftentimes there's a real need underneath that to feel okay. And it's almost like if things aren't perfect, then I feel worried or anxious or ill at ease. And so on the one hand, it's having compassion for that perfectionistic tendency. And another thing is to realize that the growth path for ones is really about getting worse. So most types need to get better, need to improve themselves, but ones are already overdoing self-improvement. And especially for the perfectionistic ones, it's good to remind them that actually their job is to be imperfect and to be more disorganized and to take it easy and lighten up and relax and have fun. And so giving them room to really not be perfect and giving them permission to not have to do it right is a real gift.
So calling a one a perfectionist is just more criticism that they're going to sort of put in the hopper of, I've got to do better.
It can be. I do think sometimes it is descriptive. Self-preservation ones will relate to that term, and it can be helpful to sort of say, okay, I'm too perfectionistic and that's something I need to work on. Or it's been a strength. I've been able to do a lot of things very well because I'm so on top of all the details. Often these things aren't one way or another. However, yes, it can also be important to not pigeonhole someone as perpetually being perfectionistic or being too much of a control freak.
So I've been thinking about this in terms of people in my life and how I could influence them, because I'm not in the body triad. But I would imagine that if a person is an 8, 9, or a 1 and they start to integrate some of these myths, what ends up happening if a person attaches to one of these misconceptions?
I think sometimes it makes it harder to grow, or it's just a way they beat themselves up. Certainly ones can be very sensitive to criticism, and something that you may not intend as a criticism, they can take that way. So even the label of perfectionist can be something that ones makes it harder for ones to develop. So I think we need to always be careful not only of the myths and misconceptions we may have about type, but also the language we use and the way we may not always, again, be giving people room to grow.
So the one pattern I'm noticing from a lot of these misconceptions is, and this is what I love about the 27 subtypes, I'm noticing it's like one of maybe the most obvious of that type gets globbed onto the entire experience of it. In other words, like you're saying, that perfectionist is one of the 3 subtypes in the number 1 type, right? There's this notion that we define all ones as perfectionists, but it's really the self-preservation ones that are really that way the most. And it looks to me that the 27 subtypes, and when we break them down, you get so much more fidelity in understanding this isn't all ones, it's the one of the ones. Do you get what I'm saying? And so
Yes.
I'm seeing that these myths are applied to typically maybe the most obvious expression of one of those subtypes coming through that type. And that's one thing I really appreciate you bringing the 27 subtypes to us and the work you've done with us in the Enneagram Roadmap and your book and all the stuff that you talk about, because it gives us a sense of, okay, this is way more generalized than how this actually shows up for real people. And I appreciate that. I don't know if you want to speak more to that or not, but I think that's some of the wisdom in these subtypes.
Yes, I agree. I think some of the myths and misconceptions we're discussing can apply to all people of that type, of different subtypes. But I do think that some of the myths grow out of the fact that not all Enneagram books and Enneagram teachers have had access to this particular approach. And so sometimes they haven't been able to reflect what I see as these really important nuances between different subtypes. And so that's one of the reasons why I like to highlight the subtypes, as you're saying, is to say, okay, we may have an idea that only really applies to one subtype of this type, but we really need to recognize how we've been overgeneralizing to all people of that type.
And as content creators, I mean, the 3 of us here in this conversation understand there's this fine balance of making things accessible for people, especially if they're not going to go study the system in completion or entirety, to give them an accessibility to it, but also give them as much fidelity as possible. And so there's always this push-pull for teachers in the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs world to try to get that balance right, because you don't want to overcomplicate it for somebody maybe starting out. So you use some of these, like you have names for the different ones, the peacekeeper, or the peacemaker for the 9. And it's like an easy way for maybe somebody new to get a sense of starting, but yet it's not the complete picture. So just understand, if you're listening along, maybe you're at an access point where some of these things you resonated with because you're early in your stage of understanding the Enneagram, which is cool. Maybe you latched onto one of the labels or the names or some of the general overarching themes of that type. And I think that's a good starting point. What Beatrice is sharing is, don't stop there. Don't think that's the end all be all of that type. There is much more to learn about how those express. And you, on your journey as you're studying the Enneagram, I just want to encourage you to keep going down that road, because there's a wealth of endless expandability to the system, really.
Right. I think this tension that you're identifying is really important between things that you necessarily need to just learn first because you're new to it, and the complicated or more complex nature of the system that you can continue to learn as you grow. I think another really important tension that's sort of underlying what we're talking about here is what's come before and newer information. Because I know in the Enneagram world, the way I've tried to look at things is we're still decoding the Enneagram symbol. We're still learning. We should always have an open mind to kind of learning new things as we understand more and more of the system. And I think sometimes people just, they've written a book or they've taught about it and they've done some really good work with the Enneagram, but they may not recognize that there's new information coming in that can enhance the way we see things. So I think there's sort of the beginning, simple ideas versus the greater complexity as you move on in your studies. But there's also this sense of what's come before historically and the new understandings that are evolving. One of the things I love about talking to you guys is that we can continue these discussions to really discuss what we're developing or the new understandings that we're having.
Yeah. And I think for me, when I'm learning a system or when I'm going further down the, like the rabbit's trail of, say, Myers-Briggs, my sort of litmus test is what's helping me grow. And so when I see something like something that's an overgeneralization, well, if that's where the person is at the time and it's actually legitimately helping them grow at that level, that's a perfectly fine place to be. And if, say, somebody is integrating a myth or a stereotype and it's maybe giving you, some self-talk that is allowing some self-indulgent behavior, right? Like, oh, I'm an 8, I'm allowed to be angry. Mm-hmm. Or, like, I'm a 9, I'm allowed to be lazy or slothful, even though that's actually not an inherent or intrinsic part of their type. It's an element that's attempting to point an arrow at something deeper and more underlying that needs to be addressed. But if a person just sort of integrates that as part of their identity, then it's not going to facilitate growth. So going down the rabbit's trail and getting more of this, as you guys have been talking about, fidelity and nuance, for me, it's always like commensurate with it helping facilitate growth. And so I think what's nice about the concept of what we're talking about today is that when we are aware of some of these things, not only can we avoid using them as a crutch, but we can also observe how we're behaving towards people of these types so that we can use sort of, more encouraging language, more, accurate perspectives in order to, deal with a person to help facilitate, not that we grow for others, but we can be a node in the system that's helping or harming, and then try to let go of some of these stereotypes in order to make sure that our language is encouraging other people's growth path too.
Exactly. Almost having a more expansive view of the type allows for you to recognize healthier versions of that type, So sometimes I've seen people, they'll meet a 1 who's actually light and humorous and not so perfectionistic, and they'll think, well, that person can't be a 1, right? And so I think we need to have an expansive, open-minded view that allows for people to grow. And I also agree with you completely about the true test of anything in the theory should be, does it help me grow? And this is the reason why I teach the subtype version I teach now, because earlier versions of subtypes didn't help me at all. They were confusing. I didn't understand them. And I wasn't accessing this level of the system at all to further my growth until I learned the approach that I teach now in 2004, because it helped me enormously. And so that's one of the reasons why I tried to gather more information about it and bring it out, because for me, it revolutionized my personal growth. And I wanted other people to have access to that piece of it.
All right, we're not done yet. We are going to pick this conversation up on the next episode because we want to go through the next set of 3 types, 2, 3, and 4 on the next episode and talk about that triad. And if you haven't picked up a copy of Beatrice's book, The Complete Enneagram, we won't even pitch our Personality Hacker book on this podcast because we really want you to go get that book. Like right now, that's like something I think that, especially for this conversation, to have that under your, on your bookshelf, that will unlock a whole world to you. And in fact, I'd recommend, if you're really interested in following this rabbit trail down, get the Enneagram Roadmap that we've published with Beatrice here at Personality Hacker, because I think that's going to really illustrate to you. We've got a lot of growth tools in that too, to take the system and apply it for your personal growth journey, which is just fantastic in my mind. So thank you, Beatrice, for being here this week. Let's reconnect again on the next podcast and keep this conversation going around these myths and misconceptions, and then we can continue the conversation on the next episode. So thanks for being here, and we'll talk to you on the next show.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to talking about the heart types in the next episode.
Yeah, and if you've been listening on this episode, we want to hear from you. You've been the 4th person in this conversation. You haven't had a microphone, but you can come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this show. There's a spot for you to leave your feedback, ask your questions, or, well, we love to hear your story. Come over and share your story. If you're one of these types or you have one of these types in your life, we'd love to hear about that. What have you seen from the Enneagram system in your life? What's resonating with you? If you're one of these types that Beatrice is talking about today, have you over-attached to one of these myths or misconceptions or stereotypes? Have you figured out some more nuance? Are you working in your subtype, your specific subtype, if you're one of these types? Share your story. We want to hear it. And you can do that over at personalityhacker.com.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That's extremely helpful. And if you'd like to get a copy of Beatrice's book, the first one, or actually she's got 2 published. The first one is called The Complete Enneagram, and the second one is called The 9 Types of Leadership. Both are fabulous books. I strongly recommend going and grabbing yourself a copy. See, I didn't even plug our book.
Yeah, that's great. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.